Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started in just a few minutes and let people pour on in. Those of you recently joining, we are going to get started in just a moment at 3 minutes past the hour. Okay. Welcome everyone to our new monthly webinar series, Building Native Agriculture, Sowing the Seeds of Growth Through Capacity Building, presented by the Native American Agriculture Fund in association with Chris Roper and his team at Indigenous Ag LLC. Today's topic is funding opportunities and writing a grant. If you have any questions to ask during or after, please do so using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You can type in your question and we will answer those questions as we start to conclude the webinar. We will be sending this PowerPoint presentation, the recording of the webinar, and a link to register for the next webinar in this series via email to all registrants the next day. I hope everyone enjoys this excellent opportunity. I'm going to pass it on to Sandy Martini to introduce our presenters.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandy Martini, Director of Compliance and Operations here at NAF. And it is my pleasure to introduce our two presenters today. And I'll start with Mr. Roper, Chris Roper. He is a specialist in agricultural manufacturing and complex project management. He's a graduate of Oklahoma State University with a degree in construction science. He's got 15 years managing construction projects experience, and that includes various capacities. His projects range in size from $1 million to $200 million. Projects included here are large-scale ag projects, hospitals, school facilities, casinos, hotels, condominiums, office buildings, daycares, wellness centers, meat processing facilities, greenhouses, coffee roasting facilities, microbreweries, housing justice centers, animal feeding and processing facilities. You can see he has a lot of experience in this area. In 2010, Chris began working with the Quapaw Nation in Northeast Oklahoma under Chairman Berry. And while there, he oversaw all the construction projects for the nation and began building the now multi-million-dollar programs. The programs began with bison and then went into cattle, greenhouses, honeybees, coffee roasting, meat processing, animal feeding, finishing, row crops, farmers markets, internship programs, and dog training. Today, Chris continues at it as an independent consultant with tribes and tribal organizations throughout the nation on various economic developments, agricultural endeavors, and food sovereignty projects. And assisting Mr. Roper today is Shelby Crum, and she's actually going to be doing most of the presenting here as she is an expert in funding opportunities and grant writing. And Miss Shelby is a program manager there with Chris, and she is just about to complete her master's in public health at University of Oklahoma. Yay. And she began working with Chris about 3 years ago and has experience in various types of agriculture projects like farmers markets, food sovereignty analysis, surveys and reports, project and grant management. And with that, I'm gonna let Mr. Roper and Ms. Crum get started. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you everybody for joining us today. This is our second webinar in the third Thursday series that we started last month. Hopefully you all joined us last month as well, as we were talking about planning agricultural projects and mainly focusing on meat processing facilities. The planning that you go through and steps you go through also tie with grant writing. So when you're thinking about a project that you want to build and develop, a lot of folks are looking at how they can fund those. And we spoke a little bit about that last month, and we're going to dive a little bit deeper into funding mechanisms and specifically grant opportunities. So when you're planning and developing, that data that you collect and develop will be used in your grant application. So we're going to continue to build on this information for you every month. And obviously, if you have any questions, please reach out. We'll have our contact information at the end of the webinar presentation again today. We got a lot of great feedback from last month's webinar, and we will incorporate your comments and we'll make changes and try to add interesting facts if you are looking for something specific, but please let us know. And if you have any questions from our last webinar last month, please feel free to keep asking questions. We want to reach out and assist any way we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miss Shelby Crum. Shelby has written multiple grants for multiple agencies, different finance groups, private and government funded. Shelby has a lot of experience seeking out grants, writing grants, grant management, the follow through and reporting. These are all things that you have to really stay on top of. A lot of people look at it and think once you get a grant, you're home free, but that's really when the work begins. And once you obtain that grant and you actually develop a project, you have to follow that project through all the way through the reporting periods. If you don't do that, it can really give you some bad marks with that agency for the future. So you want to keep your avenues open for years and years to come, and keep yourself successful with those agencies once you do obtain a grant with them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shelby, and please ask questions along the way, and we'll try to get those answered here at the end of the webinar. But thank you all for joining us.
You can go ahead and go to the agenda slide now. Thank you, Chris. So during this talk today, we're going to be talking about first, just starting with the basics of what is a grant and what can you use them for. Next will be how to find grants once you decided that that's what you wanted to pursue, developing relationships and partnerships, getting started with that grant application, planning out your project, developing the budget for it, and then just some overall tips and tricks for developing your best grant proposal possible. and if you get stuck on when and where you can get help with these grant applications. Next slide. So what is a grant? Grant is money provided by a funder for a specific project or purpose. And so it is not a loan, and you generally do not have to pay back the money. However, like Chris said, you are getting this money to complete a grant as promised. And so you are telling them that you will do X, Y, Z. And if you don't do that, then you may have to pay back those funds. And any unused funds, you're developing a budget. And if you don't spend that budget, as you said that you would, you may have leftover money that could have to be returned depending on who the funder is. This whole webinar is going to be kind of generalized information. It's not going to be covering any one specific grant because they are all so different. Every organization is different. Every funder is different. And so we're just going to keep it very general. But there are 4 different types of grants that you should be aware of so that you know what to look for as you're applying. There are competitive grants, formula funding, continuation funding, and pass-through funding. First is competitive grants, and that's going to be the one that I'm going to be covering throughout the webinar. In this case, you're going to be submitting an application and you're going to be competing against other organizations and for an allotted amount of money. And whoever the grants that have the best scores overall from those review teams will be the ones who get the funding. With formula funding, it's a little different in that generally it's everybody will apply, and every application who gets above a certain score will all get funding. Continuation funding is in cases where maybe you already have a grant through an organization and you want to continue that project on into the next year. You can apply for continuation funding. And pass-through funding is where you start getting into sub-grantees. An organization will receive funding and someone else, they can then pass on those funds to another organization. But as I said, the ones we'll be covering in this webinar will be mainly competitive grants. Next slide. So how do you find grants? The first main resource is grants.gov. You can find a list of all the federal grants on this website. It is free and it is sponsored by the government, so it is a reliable source that you can use. And in the future, on the next slide, I'll have some screenshots of that. But other sources are newsletters, such as the NAF newsletter. They often have funding opportunities that are relevant to Native American agriculture. So if you haven't already, I highly suggest that you subscribe to that. You can also get newsletters from the funders themselves. The USDA, for example, has newsletters for all their different departments. And you can be one of the first to know when all these opportunities come out. They usually send out reminders as deadlines are approaching and things like that. And it's not just the USDA that does that, most funders do. So once you've identified some places who do offer grants, be sure to sign up for all of those so that you are in the know. A third option is candid.org. And this is a paid subscription service. So this is not a resource that you have to use by any means. But if you are a serious grant writer or you don't necessarily have the time to do a lot of grant research on your own, then this is a great resource, and they have very detailed funder profiles already compiled for you. So you don't have to do a lot of background research to see if an organization is a good fit for yours. And in general, the grant writing season is October through March. There's a lot of deadlines right around the holidays and into the beginning of the new year. It kind of goes along with the fiscal calendar. However, don't just look for grants during these time periods. They are open all year round. But just if you are going to be getting into grant writing, be prepared to be very busy during these months and have all of your basic information ready to go so that you can jump right into project planning once all these start opening up. Next slide. So this is a screenshot from grants.gov. And as from the home page, as you can see, I clicked on the search grants tab up at the top. And from there, you can type in different keywords. You could type in agriculture. and they will pop up. You could also search for opportunities such as the USDA down on the side. They have different categories. You can also click on eligibility, which is a big one. If you are a government, then it'll only show you options that are available for governments. If you're a nonprofit, you can also select that option. And so there's all these different things. You can also see which ones are forecasted, which is great to kind of plan out what's going to be due even before they are open. And one of the things that I really like about this is that you can see the opportunity titles on the right. You can see when they're posted. You can also see when they close, and you can sort by the ascending or descending due dates so that you can get them all on your calendar and make sure you know which ones are due and in what order. But this is a great place to see a lot of different grant options and see what you apply for. But it just as a warning, it can be a little overwhelming. There are a lot of grants on here and you will not qualify for most of them. So there will be a long list that you do qualify for. However, these are not just agriculture grants. These are not just for Native Americans. They cover anything and everything related to federal grants. So make sure that you are using your keywords and your filters on the side to make sure that you're only seeing relevant information. Next slide. This is a screenshot from candid.org. And this is their sample funder profile. As I said, it's a paid service. So this is what you can kind of see for free to see if this is something that you're interested in. This is this is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, but this could also be something like the Native American Agriculture Fund or something like that. And you can see on here, who are they funding? They want to fund, this organization wants to fund higher education, public health. What I'm not seeing on this list is agriculture. So, if I'm in agriculture and I have a grant, then, maybe this isn't the person that I'm going to spend my time and resources applying to. But you can also see what states are getting the money and how big are the grants. This one has $100,000 to $500,000 range. So if I have $1 million project, that might be a match, that might not be. So you can kind of get general information like that. That is a little harder to find on your own. Next slide. Also on this profile, on a computer or a phone, this would just be if I scroll down a little ways, you can see all of the grants that this foundation has offered, a list of all of them, when they were due, the grant amount, and what got them. Next slide. And you can also see the application and the RFPs, which is the request for proposals. You can see the deadlines for the different grants and things that you should submit and have ready to go before you start applying. If there's a grant that you are interested on this website, it is all conveniently located in one place. Next slide. And this is at the bottom of that Candid profile. It has all their different funding interests. So you can go through and see if that funder matches any of your topic areas for your projects. Again, grant writing can be very time consuming and it's a lot of work to get proposals in. And so this can help you narrow down to see if your project is a good fit for this organization, so you aren't spending a lot of time on something that may not get funded. Next slide. The next, we're going to be talking about developing relationships both with your funding agency and with other organizations of the same mission. So first is getting to know your funding agency. Don't be intimidated to pick up the phone and call somebody or send an email to someone from the funding organization. They're just normal people with jobs like you and I. And it does help to build a personal relationship and just make small talk, ask about their significant other, their kids, the weather even. Just give them a distraction. Being a grant manager can be very redundant. So, that would be a nice break for them. Just don't ramble or be pushy. You're doing this with genuine intentions, not to try to get extra points on an application, because that will not work. But you can call them with educated questions. Don't ask questions that are very clearly printed in the RFA. That can make you look incompetent, and you want to seem like you have read everything and are asking maybe a deeper question or that's more specific to your project. Finally, this does give them a point of contact for future opportunities. If you've called and you are talking about projects that you're interested in and maybe it's not the best fit, but if they do have something that comes up in the future, they might remember that you called or that you contacted them with an idea, and they could reach out to you with future opportunities. And this relationship will help in the long run, especially if you are funded. This can help with compliance questions. They know who to contact about that. And a lot of funders will do site visits, and that can give them a point of contact, and you can get to know that person even better. On the other hand, you can also partner with organizations that have the same mission. This can be both locally or nationally, depending on what your project is. But one benefit of this is that it can expand your eligibility. For example, if you're a tribal organization and you want to partner with a school, all of a sudden you have all these grants that only schools qualify for, and you have all the grants that tribes qualify for at your disposal. You can apply through different organizations and kind of share that money depending on what the grant is. This also strengthens your application. You are showing the funder that your project is well supported in your community. There's a need for it, and others who are doing similar things, instead of competing against them, you are now collaborating with them and doubling the strength of your proposal. Next slide. So how do you get started with your grant once you have done all of this? Your first step is to read the RFA or RFP. Those are used pretty interchangeably. Read that thoroughly and then read it again. That's going to be basically everything that you're going to need to know for this grant. It's going to have all of your eligibility criteria. And as a heads up for federal grants, part of that eligibility criteria does include a SAM number, which stands for System for Award Management. I've actually never seen that really spelled out anywhere. It's always just a SAM number. But that can take weeks to get. So if your organization does not already have one, you do need to get on that fairly quickly into that application process to make sure that something as simple as that number is not what prevents you from applying. The other eligibility criteria are to make sure that your type of organization is eligible to apply for that grant. A lot of grants do specify whether they want a nonprofit, whether they want a tribal government, whether they want a school or a CDFI in NAF's case. All these different organizations have specific grants that they're eligible for. And next, it also includes all of the requirements, and you need to make sure that you see these and understand them, and still make sure that this is a grant that you want to apply for. It can include fiscal matches, whether you have a 25% match or a 50% match or no match at all. It can really just depend. You also want to see what your reporting commitments are, whether you're reporting monthly, quarterly, annually. And those will take time to fill out and collect all that data for. You need to make sure that you are willing to meet all of those requirements before you submit your application. NAF in particular, and other grants can do it as well, require a waiver of sovereign immunity. If you have a tribal government, is your leadership willing to sign this? And if they're not, then maybe consider not applying for that grant. This is also specific to tribes, but does your tribe need a resolution to submit an application? How involved does your leadership want to be in the grant writing process? Do they need to approve all the project ideas? Do they just need to know that you applied, or do they not care? You need to find that out in advance and see if you need a resolution. And finally, something to look for is the payment schedules. Some grants will require that you pay for some things out of pocket and have to get reimbursed later. Some will pay it all up front, which is rare. Most grants will pay most of the money up front, but they always usually withhold some to make sure that you're meeting your reporting requirements. And if they do that, can you afford to pay the project expenses while you're waiting to be reimbursed? Next slide. So if you meet all the criteria and you decide that this is a grant that you want to apply for, you can start planning out your project. So you can use planning tools to organize your thoughts. Some examples are a logic model, a SWOT analysis, mind maps. I'll give a couple examples in the next slide, but you're going to use these to really flesh out the details of your project so that you can explain it to someone who's not familiar. You're going to want to support your project with data to identify and support your needs. You're going to need to tell the grantor why your area needs this money. And so this really is building on what we talked about in last month's webinar with using the data from the food sovereignty assessments, from the feasibility studies, from the business plans. And if you don't already have this data collected when a grant opportunity opens, in most cases, it's already going to be too late. If you have very motivated individuals, you can get this data in time. However, it's better and much less stressful if you have these data already collected, already ready to go before you start looking into grant opportunities. And if you want more information on those, you can contact NAF and try to get that recording or possibly find it online. Next, you want to align your project with the funder's mission and their grant objectives. They have a specific purpose for their funding that they're opening up this grant to, and you need to make sure that your project aligns with what they are wanting to fund. Next, develop a timeline based on your funding schedule. In my experience, I've rarely had grant timelines that align well with the growing season or that align exactly with when I want my project months to be, but you have to adapt and figure out what that timeline is going to look like so that when you are describing your project, it makes sense for their timeline that they're giving you. Next slide. So these are some examples of those planning tools I was talking about. The one on the left is a logic model. What you do with this one in that first column, you're going to put your inputs. This is how many staff members you'll need. Will you need, how much grant funding will you need? What supplies are you going to have to purchase? What services are you going to have to provide in order to get this project going? Your outputs are going to be the activities that you're going to do during the grant, whatever those may be. And your participation is going to be how many people you're serving, how many, for a farmer's market, for example, your output may be that you hold 10 market dates. You have 100 customers per market. You educated 50 people at this farmer's market. I do a lot of rural farmers markets, so my numbers are usually small for these, if you can't tell. But so then you're going to move on to your outcomes. You have short, medium, and long-term outcomes. And if you can explain these in the short section, then you will have a much better shot of explaining them in the narrative. You know, what are you actually trying to accomplish with this project? And you're going to need to tell the funder that. You're also going to, what assumptions are you making about the project? For a farmer's market, for example, we're assuming that people want to eat fruits and vegetables. We're assuming that if they have access to them, they will come and they will purchase them. External factors are other things that you can't really control. And for the last year, that a big one in that category has been COVID. So think through all of those things, and then this will not only help you build out your application, but also it's a snapshot of the whole project that can be quickly read in a couple minutes to help someone outside the organization understand what you're trying to do. Another one that's a little less structured, if you're a little more free-flowing, is a mind map. Everything is connected in agriculture and our food system. And so, you know, start with your idea and start branching out of what that's going to look like. What's that going to lead to? You know, what do you need to make that happen? And so either one of those are fine. You can make your own. You can do a different planning tool, but these are some that I have used. Next slide. So next, you need to develop a budget. And the first thing that I like to do for that is to check the minimum and maximum award limits. That's kind of the basis to making sure that you are falling within that range. It depends on the funder, but some will, if you're outside of that range, they may exclude your application immediately. Some others will allow you to go over or under, but you have to add extra explanation on why it is that you're outside that range. And you need to know which grants are which. Will they throw it out immediately, or can you explain? And something else we're going to look at is if the grant requires matching funds. I touched on this briefly earlier, but there are really two main types of matching funds. One is a cash fund, in which case you'll actually have to contribute cash towards the project. And one I think that is easier for a lot of organizations to give is in-kind matches, which is just the value of your personnel, of your supplies, services, or indirect costs that you're donating to this project. If you already have staff members hired and maybe they can donate some of their time to this project, and that can be your match for whatever the value of their time is. Are there limits for indirect funds? This is kind of a loaded question because first you need to know what your indirect fund rate is for your organization. Do you have an agreement established that has a specified rate? And you need to know, if you don't know what it is, then you need to find someone in your organization who does know what it is and get that document. And some grants will limit it. Some grants will say you have a 10% limit on indirect, some is 15%. So if your organization is sitting at a 50% indirect rate, what are you going to do about that difference? Will your organization allow you to cover that difference? Can that be part of your in-kind matching, or is that a deal breaker? And those are all things that you need to work through as you're developing this budget. Next is, what are the allowable purchases? This varies vastly from grant to grant. And so this is something that you really need to look at. For example, I get asked a lot to get farm equipment. People want tractors, people want us to build buildings. But construction and big equipment costs like that are not always allowed. Especially those two items in particular are very rare to find a grant that will cover them. And so you need to know that if those are something that you're trying to get funded, you need to check to see if that is allowed by that grant and save yourself a lot of time if it's not. Next. So these are some general tips for developing your grant proposal. First, you want to start early. You're typically only going to have 30 to 90 days to apply for a grant from the time that the RFA is released until it is due, and that is not a lot of time. You're typically going to want to start reading that RFA the day or two that it's released and to get started on that paperwork. So by the time, it does help if you have your data already in line and if you already have some ideas in mind, but different organizations do things differently. And I know there are organizations out there who will see an RFA and then, oh, what do we want to do that fits this? And so if you're starting from scratch like that, you're going to want to definitely get started immediately. Next, you want to write the application to focus on the funding agency's desired content, not what you think is important. So the questions that they ask are things that are important to them, and you have a limited amount of space in that application. They all have either word limits or page limits, and you need to tell them what is important to them about your project. One way you can do this is to use the language straight from the RFA. If they say farmers and ranchers in theirs, then maybe use that language instead of producers, just to make it extra clear. That's just one example, but you never know who is going to be reviewing your grant. You don't know if it's going to be someone who is very familiar with your location, with your with the terminology that you're using. But if you use the language straight from the RFA, that's probably going to be the language that's also on their rubrics for scoring. And it just makes it that much easier to just say, okay, here's exactly what I wanted to read, check that box. Next is answer all of the questions in a grant application. This may seem obvious, but there are often questions inside of questions. For example, if they want you to explain the staff's experience and the roles and responsibilities for the project, Make sure you don't just explain their experience and then move on, or just explain their role and move on. Make sure you're getting all parts of that question. And don't assume the reviewers know anything about your organization, your location, or your service. I've been a reviewer, and sometimes people won't include the state of their organization even. They'll describe their community, and as I'm mentally trying to picture where they are and what this looks like, I'm like, I don't even know what part of the country you're in. And, like they leave out things like that are very obvious to the person that's applying. But as a reviewer, a lot of grants will try to intentionally, especially the USDA, will try to place you with reviewers who are not from your region, so there's no conflict of interest. And so a lot of the time you're going to be starting with a blank slate, and you need to get those very basic details included. Next slide. So as I'm telling you to include all of these details and use their language, you also need to be concise. And it is a challenge for grant writing. And one of the best things, a piece of advice that I heard from somebody that kind of sticks with me as I'm writing these grants, is that grant writing is not always good writing. It doesn't always have to flow and use a lot of commas and use all this descriptive, flowy language. Sometimes you just need to be concise and get straight to the point and tell them what they want to hear. And that making sure that it is clear and understandable is often way more important than having big, flowy, descriptive words that the reviewer might not even know what they mean sometimes. So next is utilize your organization's strengths. What makes you unique? Why are you qualified to run this project? And again, the reviewer probably may not know who your organization is. If you developed a relationship with them, sometimes they will, sometimes they won't, but it never hurts to show that, this is what we've done in the past. We have a great track record. Here's what we want to do next, and give them confidence that you can do this job. Next, think long-term. Can you sustain this project if grant funding ends? This is especially important for projects like a meat processing plant, like Chris works on a lot. If you get startup funds and loans to build this whole building, and you get grants to add in all these extra projects to it, if you want to make it educational, and if you were to lose grant funding after the end of the year or 2 years, can you keep that project going? Can you pay all those people that you have on the grant? And if not, then you need to think about what that's going to look like if it were to end. Kind of think worst case scenario, or what are you going to do to make sure that it doesn't end? Next is proofread, proofread, proofread. Have someone who is unfamiliar with the project review it if possible. This is another reason why it helps to start early. If you pass it to someone maybe in a different department of your organization, or someone who hasn't been involved in helping plan out every piece of this project, have them read it and see what makes sense to them and if they have any questions. Because a lot of the times you're going to skip over a detail that is so obvious to you, but is not obvious to someone else. And lastly, don't wait until the last minute to submit. I think we're all guilty of this at some point, but I've had applications that I waited till the last minute to submit it, and my Wi-Fi went down or something like that, and it didn't get submitted in time. And so you do all this work, or maybe the website crashes, maybe it's such a popular application that or scheduled maintenance even on grants.gov, that happens. And so don't wait until last minute to submit. And if you can do it even days before, you'll feel a lot better about it. Next slide. So if you're going through all of this, hopefully by this point, you're feeling like you know what to do. But if you're not, and you're sitting there like, I'm going to need some more help, here are some other resources that you can use. A lot of the specific grants will have webinars and FAQs for their grant in particular. And we chose not to go that route because every grant is so unique. They ask different questions, they want different requirements. And so find that exact grant's webinars. Almost all of them will do at least 1 or 2 webinars, and you can ask live questions about that grant. Next, grants.gov has a resource library. It is free to use, and I highly encourage you to look through those resources as well as you're going through this process. Next, you can also find other grant writing and management trainings. You can spend days in grant writing trainings and still feel like you have a lot to learn. So check out those if you want to do that. If you want help applying for grants, if the trainings aren't really your thing, then you can also hire grant writing consultants. I do that. That's how I make a lot of my living. Ideally, you want to start reaching out to people before the RFA opens. If you know what the project is going to be, especially when you're bringing in an outsider who may not be familiar with your organization, time is of the essence. And so if you know that this is something that's going to be coming out and you want to start brainstorming, Chris is also great about this. He'll meet with tribes or organizations and they'll kind of get a whole plan together. Here's what we want to do for the next 5 years. And, here's what we need to start doing. And then you start looking at grants from there, and you can have consultants help with that planning process. And next is if you need help with certain project obstacles, if you got the grant and that is great, congratulations, and you're running into issues or compliance questions, then that's where you can contact your funder's grant officer and get specific help with those types of things. Next slide. So this is the end of my presentation. I just wanted to go ahead in our upcoming webinars. We're doing this the third Thursday of each month. And so our next one will be on August 19th. And what is the avenue to standing up infrastructure? And this is our contact information. If you have any questions, both Chris and I's phone number and email address are there. And I think we might have some questions. And I'll go ahead and open the floor to questions now.
Thank you, Shelby. I had a couple things too I want to add that just popped in my mind as Shelby was talking, but she did briefly mention it, but whatever organization you're working with, build yourself a grant schedule. Know when some of these grants are coming out, and that way you can start working on them early. As Shelby mentioned, sometimes you only get 30 or 60 days to respond to these grants. And if you're going to build a new building or stand up a large project, you're going to need blueprints, you're going to need budgets, you're going to need schedules, you're going to need a lot of different things. So you're not going to necessarily be able to get all that done in 30 or 60 days. So that's where these grant schedules can really be beneficial. If you know a grant's coming out in December, you might need to work on that for 6 months to get all the information together before you can be ready to submit. So use those grant schedules. And again, there's a lot of assistance out there, different consulting groups, different companies. Be careful when you're selecting companies to work on specific grants. Some grants are regional grants. So, people can be working on grants that you might be competing with your neighbor on. Some grants are national grants, so you might just be competing, nationwide, but it's something to be aware of. Sometimes grant writers can be writing a grant for, your neighbor, and you don't necessarily want to be competing with your neighbors on the same grant. So be very careful about that. On large projects, we have used multiple grants on the same project. Some people think that you can't use more than one grant, but you can. But you have to read the documents, read all of the RFA to see if other grants are allowable to be used as matches or to coincide together. So that is something else you really have to look for. Grant management and compliance, we've touched on it, but we cannot touch on it enough. Once you receive a grant, the compliance part of this is extremely important. A lot of the smaller tribes may not have a grant manager separate from the grants department. Typically, a grants department inside of a tribe or even a nonprofit is typically writing grants year round. So the grant management aspect of that sometimes gets forgotten about. And grant compliance, there's a lot of reporting measures that must be done once you are awarded a grant. So make sure that you think through the process. If it's a large grant, it could have a lot of reporting requirements that you must do throughout the grant period. So make sure that you have somebody allocated to do this for compliance and reporting, even as you're applying for a grant. It might be something that you may have to include cost, or you may have to think about how you're going to manage this operation again after you finish the project. So operational costs are a big cost to a lot of facilities. So you just think through the project, and good luck on all your grant endeavors. And if we can ever be of service to any of you, please let us know. So Graham, with that, if you have any questions we need to address, we can start that process.
Currently, I'm seeing no questions in our question and answer box.
Okay.
Well, thank you all for attending today. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to our NAF team at media@nativeamericanagriculturefund.org. Thank you very much, Mr. Roper. Thank you, Shelby. Everyone take care.
Thank you all.